Almost everyone tells the Watcher story as though the verdict were already in. Heavenly beings break rank, descend to earth, take human women, and drag the world toward ruin. It sounds like rebellion from the first step, but one ancient Jewish work places something startling before the fall: a purpose, a commission, a task connected with teaching, justice, and setting human life in order. Once that detail is restored, the story changes shape. The descent is no longer automatically the crime. The tragedy begins when a vocation is betrayed. That claim does not come from Genesis. Genesis gives a far more compressed baseline. Divine beings see human women, take wives, and produce a generation associated with the Nephilim and renowned warriors. It does not say that these beings were sent to teach. It does not describe a righteous commission before their transgression. It does not name their leaders, record a collective oath, catalog forbidden arts, explain the spirits of dead giants, or describe post-flood demonic activity. Those details belong to later source lanes and must not be smuggled backward into Genesis. Even the nearby statement in Genesis 6 verse 3 has a disputed relation to the surrounding episode. Genesis 6 verse 4 says the Nephilim were present in those days, and also afterward, but it gives no hidden mechanism for that phrase. No genetics, no protected bloodline, no secret route around the flood. What Genesis emphasizes instead is human wickedness. The imagination of the human heart is persistently evil. The earth is filled with corruption and violence, and those conditions become stated grounds for judgment. Supernatural actors are present, but human responsibility never disappears. So our investigation begins with an absence. The Bible gives the outline, but not the moral sequence that will define Jubilees. To recover that sequence without creating a blended legend, we have to keep three voices separate. Genesis reports. First, Enoch expands. Jubilees recasts. Each tells a related catastrophe. Each asks a different question. And only one begins the Watcher's descent with an authorized task. Genesis reports. First, Enoch expands. Jubilees recasts. Those transitions are not stylistic decoration. They are the guardrails of the episode. Genesis gives a compressed account of divine beings, women, Nephilim, human wickedness, violence, and the flood. First, Enoch turns that compressed episode into a large drama. In its Book of the Watchers, desire leads to deliberation, a collective oath, named leaders, illicit instruction, giant violence, appeals from heaven, differentiated judgments, and Enoch's work as messenger and recorder. The oath belongs to First Enoch. It cannot be silently inserted into Genesis, and it should not be treated as though Jubilees narrates the same scene in the same way. Jubilees does something more selective and, for this episode, more disruptive. It places the Watchers inside a rewritten history organized through Moses, heavenly tablets, law, and chronology. It retains the catastrophe, but changes the moral starting point. Before Jubilees describes the Watchers taking wives, it says they descended to teach and to enact justice or uprightness among human beings. That creates three separate questions. What does Genesis actually report? How does First Enoch expand the Watcher tradition? And what changes when Jubilees places a legitimate purpose before the violation? Keeping those questions separate protects us from a blended, omniscient story that no single source tells. It also reveals why Jubilees is not merely a stranger version of Genesis. Its distinctive force lies in sequence. Omission comes first. Transgression comes later. The Watchers are not introduced only as rebels entering the world to corrupt it. They enter under a stated purpose, and their fall becomes the corruption of that purpose. The next step is therefore narrow but decisive. We need to follow Jubilees from the commission in chapter 4 to the violation in chapter 5 without importing details from another text. Jubilees 4:15 supplies the sentence on which the episode turns. Within the work's own narrative, the Watchers descend to earth to teach human beings and to establish justice and uprightness. The exact English wording varies with translation, but the controlled point is stable. Jubilees assigns an initial mission that is not described as rebellion. Then the narrative moves forward. Jubilees 5:1 identifies the Watchers' taking of wives as violation and transgression. That order separates descent from sin. It does not make every action of the Watchers righteous, and it does not erase the catastrophe that follows. It locates the moral turning point after arrival, when a legitimate vocation crosses a boundary. This is the minimum textual finding, and it is already substantial. In many popular retellings, descent and rebellion are treated as the same event. Jubilees does not frame them that way. The sequence suggests a tragedy of corrupted vocation. Beings associated with teaching and justice become violators of the order they were meant to serve. That conclusion must remain carefully bounded. Jubilees presents the mission. It does not provide a modern institutional job description. Nor does the passage establish that Genesis once contained the same line and later lost it. There is no authority here for a censorship story. The responsible claim is literary and theological. In Jubilees, purpose precedes transgression. This change also alters the audience's question. The mystery is no longer simply, why did rebellious beings descend? It becomes, how did an authorized mission become corruption? That question will organize everything that follows. Enoch's role, the spread of violence, the judgment of different agents, the survival of harmful spirits after the flood, and the continued responsibility of human beings. The distinction is more than a technicality. If descent and rebellion are fused, the story becomes an invasion. Evil arrives from outside, already complete. But if a legitimate mission comes first, the story becomes a tragedy. The teachers of justice become violators of justice. The beings sent to help restore order become agents of disorder. That version cuts closer to human experience because corrupted vocation is not a remote myth. It is the pattern of trust betrayed from within. But before following those consequences, one word needs control. Teach can sound automatically benevolent, while the Watcher traditions also contain destructive instruction. Jubilees itself requires us to distinguish authorized teaching from illicit knowledge rather than collapsing every act of transmission into one category. Teaching is not a single moral category in these traditions. Its meaning depends on authorization, content, purpose, and consequence. In Jubilees 4, the initial mission is associated with justice or uprightness. Translators may choose different English terms, and those choices should not be forced into more precision than the underlying evidence allows. The safe conclusion is that the work presents the Watcher's first task as constructive and ordered toward right conduct. It does not present their descent as an invasion designed from the beginning to spread forbidden arts. First Enoch later describes a different kind of instruction. It attributes weapons and ornaments to Azazel and additional forbidden arts to named Watchers. That material belongs to First Enoch's expansion. It shows knowledge functioning as a vehicle of corruption, but it cannot be used to redefine the original Jubilees commission without an explicit comparison. Jubilees itself offers another contrast after the flood. In chapter 10, medicinal knowledge is given to Noah as authorized protection against harmful spirits. The narrative function differs sharply from the illicit arts in First Enoch. One teaching scene contributes to disorder, another responds to affliction. The difference is not knowledge versus ignorance. It is the moral order governing the knowledge. This distinction helps explain the phrase corrupted vocation. The Watcher's failure is not that teaching is inherently dangerous. Their failure is that agents entrusted with a purpose violate the boundaries of that purpose. The same broad human capacity, learning, recording, transmitting, can serve justice or magnify harm depending on the action and its authorization. That is also why the episode cannot be reduced to a warning against secret information. Jubilees is not telling us that all hidden knowledge is evil. It frames its own history as revealed knowledge, written on heavenly tablets and mediated to Moses. The real conflict is between ordered instruction and transgressive action. And at the center of that conflict stands Enoch, a figure whose role grows dramatically as the sources move beyond Genesis. Jubilees also turns the argument back on any simple fear of hidden knowledge. The book presents itself as revealed history, written on heavenly tablets and mediated to Moses. It cannot consistently teach that knowledge from heaven is evil by nature. Its sharper concern is whether knowledge remains inside an authorized moral order. The danger is not revelation itself. The danger is a trusted bearer who turns a gift into an instrument of violation. Genesis introduces Enoch in a few concentrated lines. He walks with God, and then he is no longer present because God takes him. Genesis does not describe him as the elaborate scribe, astronomer, witness, and recorder found in later literature. First, Enoch expands him as a commissioned messenger of judgment. He records the Watcher's petition and presents it. His position is unusual. He moves between the human world and heavenly judgment, carrying words that expose the distance between the Watcher's request and the sentence pronounced against them. Jubilees develops Enoch differently. It presents him as a writer of celestial signs and chronology, a witness against the Watchers after their sin, and a recorder of judgment. It even locates him in Eden in a continuing scribal role. These are developments beyond the compressed Genesis portrait, and they fit Jubilee's larger concern with time, law, memory, and written heavenly order. Enoch therefore becomes more than a mysterious ancestor who disappears. He becomes a contrast to the Watchers. Both are connected with knowledge, but their trajectories diverge. Enoch receives, records, and testifies within an authorized order. The Watchers begin with a stated commission and then violate it. One figure's expansion clarifies the other's fall. This contrast also creates a documentary payoff. The central issue is not whether contact between heaven and earth is automatically corrupt. Jubilees itself depends on mediated revelation. The issue is fidelity to the role given. Enoch's scribal vocation remains aligned with judgment and order. The Watcher's vocation turns toward boundary violation. The story now moves from commission and witness to consequence. Jubilees 5 does not describe one undifferentiated evil. It distributes corruption and judgment across Watchers, their offspring, humanity, and even the wider created order. That distribution matters because it prevents the supernatural story from swallowing every other form of responsibility. Seen this way, Enoch is not merely an additional character in the tradition. He is the moral mirror of the Watchers. Both stand near heavenly knowledge. Both transmit what they receive. But Enoch records, witnesses, and speaks within the role assigned to him, while the Watchers cross the boundary of theirs. The contrast makes the central question visible. Contact between heaven and earth is not automatically corrupt. Fidelity is the dividing line. Jubilees 5 begins by naming the breach. The Watchers take wives, and the text identifies the act as violation. The descent has already occurred. The transgression is now attached to a chosen crossing of boundary. The consequences spread outward, but not in a single line of blame. Jubilees says that all flesh corrupted its way. Its wording includes human beings within the wider corruption and also extends the disorder to animals. The narrative imagines a created order no longer holding its proper distinctions. Then judgment is differentiated. The sinful watchers are bound. Their giant offspring face their own destruction. Corrupt humanity is judged as well. Jubilees does not describe one guilty class while treating everyone else as passive material. It assigns wrongdoing and consequence across distinct agents. This is where the corrupted vocation reading gains causal force. Supernatural transgression matters. Jubilees gives it a real role in pre-flood disorder. Yet the text does not allow that role to become a complete excuse for humanity. The Watcher's violation helps produce catastrophe, but humans also act, corrupt, and face judgment according to their deeds. The phrase, all flesh, can tempt a modern reader toward biological speculation. The episode does not authorize that move. Jubilee's language of corrupted order is not evidence of genetics, DNA, or a protected pure bloodline. Those ideas import modern categories and claims that the source does not establish. The text's emphasis is moral, cosmic, and juridical. Boundaries are broken, violence spreads, and judgment answers the deeds of different actors. The result is more complex than a story of monsters appearing from nowhere. A legitimate mission is betrayed. The betrayal generates offspring associated with violence. Human beings participate in corruption. The wider order is depicted as disordered, and judgment does not fall in one undivided act. To understand the scale of that judgment, we have to compare how first Enoch and Jubilees describe the giants, not as a survival puzzle, but as agents within an escalating economy of violence. First Enoch makes the violence of the giants difficult to miss. Their consumption escalates, resources fail, bloodshed expands, and heavenly observers appeal over lawlessness on earth. The work differentiates the judgments directed toward Azazel, the Watchers, and the giant offspring. Its drama is detailed, named, and judicial. Jubilees is more compressed, but it preserves the central association between the Watcher's offspring and violence. It depicts giant groups turning against and destroying one another under divine judgment, then separately describes judgment on the offspring and on the Watchers. The sequence does not require a post-flood biological survival theory. It belongs to the pre-flood collapse and its consequences. The comparison reveals both continuity and difference. Both works connect the Watcher catastrophe with violent giant offspring. First, Enoch develops a broad architecture of illicit teaching, heavenly complaint, and differentiated punishment. Jubilees integrates the tradition into its own legal and chronological history, placing special emphasis on violation, ordered judgment, and continuing human accountability. That distinction matters for how we imagine the flood. Popular retellings often make the giants the entire explanation, as though humanity becomes merely collateral damage in a supernatural war. Neither the Genesis baseline nor Jubilees permits that simplification. Genesis foregrounds human wickedness and violence. Jubilees judges the giant offspring, but it also judges corrupt humanity. The giants therefore intensify the story. They do not replace its moral center. They show what the Watcher's violation produces: violence that becomes self-consuming, disorder that multiplies beyond the first act, and a judgment calibrated to different agents. This is also the point where spectacle can become misleading. Ancient giant traditions invite modern images of biology, size, and survival. But the documentary question is not how to construct a hidden genealogy after the flood. It is how Jubilees explains the transformation of an authorized mission into a network of violence. The answer is not complete until we hear the warning given to ordinary humans after the catastrophe. After the flood, Jubilees does not preserve the Watcher story merely as a tale about beings from another realm. Noah uses it as instruction for his descendants. His warning draws lessons from sexual transgression, bloodshed, and the consequences of corrupt conduct. The catastrophe becomes moral memory. Its purpose is not to let later humans say that supernatural forces caused everything. It tells them that boundaries can be violated, violence can be repeated, and judgment still concerns their own deeds. Noah himself functions as a counterexample within the corruption narrative. His righteousness does not deny the influence of supernatural evil. It demonstrates that human action remains morally meaningful inside a damaged world. Jubilees repeatedly presents human beings as judged according to what they do. This is one of the work's most important corrections to popular Watcher mythology. The more dramatic the supernatural actors become, the easier it is to transfer responsibility away from human agents. Jubilees refuses that transfer. It includes humanity in the corruption of all flesh. It describes judgment on corrupt humanity, and it turns the earlier disaster into a warning addressed to later human choices. Even transmitted knowledge can become part of that responsibility. Jubilees presents knowledge as something that can be copied and misused by human beings. The existence of a supernatural source does not make every later human act inevitable. Transmission creates possibilities. It does not erase agency. The moral architecture is therefore distributed. The Watchers violate their mission. Their offspring enact violence. Human beings corrupt their own way. Harm continues through other agents after the flood. Each element matters, but none becomes a universal explanation for every evil. That distribution prepares us for the most difficult transition in the episode. The giant bodies do not need to survive the flood for the tradition to imagine continuing affliction. First, Enoch and Jubilees describe a spiritual aftermath. To follow it responsibly, we must leave genetics behind and enter a different category of explanation. This is where the episode's title reaches beyond the ancient setting. A mission can begin well and still become destructive. Authority can be granted and then abused. Knowledge can be offered for justice and redirected toward appetite, status, or violence. Jubilees does not excuse the failure because the original commission was good. It makes the failure more serious precisely because something good was entrusted first. Genesis 6 verse 4 says, "and also afterward," but it does not specify a mechanism. It does not describe hidden survival in the ark, preserved giant DNA, or a pure human line protected from contamination. Those are later constructions, not conclusions established by the verse. First, Enoch offers a different explanation for continuing evil. In chapters 15 and 16, the spirits arising from the dead giants remain active on earth until judgment. The bodies die, the spirits continue. This is a literary and theological account of post-catastrophe affliction, not a biological theory. Jubilees also presents harmful spirits after the flood. In chapter 10, they afflict Noah's descendants. Noah responds with prayer, not with a declaration that humanity is innocent. The narrative recognizes an external source of harm while preserving the moral framework already established. The distinction is crucial. A biological survival story asks how giant ancestry crossed the flood. The spirit tradition asks how the consequences of the Watcher catastrophe remain active even after the violent offspring are destroyed. These are not interchangeable models. Jubilees and First Enoch place the continuation in the category of spirits, judgment, petition, and divine limitation. Jubilees then adds a controlled response. Angels teach Noah medicinal remedies as authorized protection. Once again, teaching is not inherently corrupt. The moral meaning depends on who authorizes it, what it serves, and how it relates to the order of the narrative. This post-flood material completes the causal chain begun with the mission in chapter 4. A commission is violated. Violent offspring emerge. Judgment destroys bodies and confines transgressors. Yet harmful spirits remain as a continuing source of affliction. The next figure in that arrangement is Mastema. He is often flattened into a familiar name from later tradition, but Jubilees gives him a specific role. We can describe that role only as far as the episode requires, without turning PFA 014 into the full demonology study reserved for the next episode. In Jubilees 10, Mastema appears as a prince who petitions to retain authority over some of the harmful spirits. The petition is not the voice of an equal power bargaining with God. Mastema operates under permission and limitation. The result is numerical and controlled within the story. 1/10 of the spirits remain, while 9/10 are confined. The surviving fraction continues under restricted authority. This arrangement explains why affliction persists after the flood without implying that judgment failed or that evil escaped divine control. Mastema can be compared functionally with later adversarial figures. He petitions, opposes, and exercises authority over harmful agents. But the text does not authorize an automatic equation with Satan. Similar function is not identical identity, and different ancient works organize adversarial figures in different ways. The restraint matters because a familiar label can erase the distinctive architecture of Jubilees. Here, Mastema is presented inside a hierarchy. He requests. Permission is granted in limited form. Most spirits are confined. The emphasis falls on bounded agency, not on a rival kingdom beyond control. This episode explains only the post-flood spirit arrangement necessary to complete Jubilees' Watcher story. A full account of Mastema and demonology belongs to PFA 015. That boundary is not a missing payoff. The payoff for this episode is causal. Jubilees can move from the destruction of violent offspring to continuing post-flood affliction without inventing biological survival. The spirits remain by a narrated arrangement, and their activity is limited. The larger demonological questions, how Mastema relates to other adversarial figures, how later traditions develop these categories, and how the full system operates, require their own evidence sequence. Here, they would distract from the central transformation. The Watcher's authorized mission becomes transgression, violence, judgment, and a controlled spiritual aftermath. With that boundary fixed, we can return to the literary world that gives Jubilees its authority, heavenly tablets, law, and ordered time. Jubilees does not present itself as a detached modern history. Within the work, an angel of the presence dictates a tablet-based account to Moses. The past is framed as information written on heavenly tablets, and the Watcher tradition is integrated into a mosaic, legal, and chronological story. That framing is a literary theological claim inside Jubilees. It tells us how the work authorizes its narrative. It is not independently verified historiography simply because the narrator locates the record in heaven. Source honesty requires us to describe both the claim and its limit. The calendar is central to Jubilees' ordered world. Time, festivals, law, and memory are woven together. But the calendar is not named as the first sin of the Watchers. Their mission should not be recast as a calendar mission without direct textual support. The narrative identifies the violation elsewhere. They take wives and cross the boundary attached to their vocation. This matters because modern retellings often convert every major theme in a book into one grand conspiracy. Jubilee's calendar can become evidence of hidden control. Its heavenly tablets can become proof that every narrated event is historically verified. Its Watcher tradition can be made to explain all later corruption. Those moves flatten distinct claims into one sensational system. The work is more interesting when its categories remain intact. Heavenly tablets express claimed revelation. The calendar organizes sacred history. Law clarifies ordered conduct. The Watcher episode dramatizes what happens when agents depart from an assigned purpose. These elements reinforce one another, but they are not interchangeable. Jubilees therefore rewrites history as morally and temporally ordered. Its distinctive Watcher sequence belongs inside that project. Descent is not automatically rebellion because the created order can include a legitimate mission from heaven to earth. Sin begins when the mission is violated. But how early and how widely was this version known? For that question, we turn from the narrative world of heavenly tablets to physical manuscript fragments found at Qumran. At Qumran, multiple Hebrew witnesses of Jubilees survive in fragmentary form. These manuscripts matter because they demonstrate ancient circulation and textual transmission. They show that Jubilees was copied and present among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do not, by themselves, answer every question people ask of them. A manuscript copy does not establish who originally wrote the work. It does not prove that the narrative is historically accurate. And the presence of multiple copies does not establish universal canonical status, either at Qumran or across ancient Judaism. Those distinctions are easy to lose because physical survival feels decisive. A fragment is tangible. It can be dated, cataloged, compared, and placed within an ancient scribal environment. But an object proves only what its evidence can bear. It proves attestation and transmission. Claims about authority, canon, community use, and historical truth require additional evidence. The transmission picture is also wider than Qumran. The complete form of Jubilees is preserved principally through the Guizi tradition used as the main base for modern critical editions. Hebrew fragments and other versional witnesses supplement that complete preservation. They help scholars compare the text's transmission, but they do not replace the complete Guizi witness. This gives us a more accurate survival story. Jubilees was not simply lost and then suddenly recovered as a forbidden secret. Parts of it survived in ancient Hebrew manuscripts. Its complete form continued in Ethiopian transmission, and its authority varied across communities and periods. The Qumran evidence therefore strengthens one conclusion and blocks another. It strongly supports ancient circulation. It does not prove universal canonicity. That boundary leads directly to reception. Why did some communities preserve and receive Jubilees differently from others? The answer is not a single dramatic act of removal. It is a long, uneven history of copying, language, community authority, and canon formation. Jubilees did not have one uniform reception across all Jewish and Christian communities. Its authority and canonical status varied by place, period, and tradition. That variation immediately complicates the claim that the Church banned Jubilees. The episode's source base does not establish one universal, coordinated act of suppression. Different communities inherited different collections. Texts could be copied in one setting, neglected in another, translated into one language, lost in another, or granted different degrees of authority without a single council or institution controlling the entire process. The complete Guizi preservation is especially important. Jubilees did not disappear from every Christian tradition. Its Ethiopian reception prevents a simple story in which the work was erased from Christianity and recovered only in modern times. The real history is uneven preservation, not universal concealment. This does not mean reception history is unimportant or free of power. Communities make boundaries. Institutions preserve some texts and not others. Language networks, liturgical use, theology, geography, and access all shape survival. But those complex processes should not be replaced by an accusation that outruns the evidence. The distinction between circulation and canon also returns here. Qumran manuscripts show that Jubilees circulated in antiquity. They do not prove that every community treated it as scripture. Ethiopian canonical reception shows enduring authority in a particular tradition. It does not establish that all churches shared the same status. A responsible documentary does not drain the mystery from this history. It relocates the mystery. The question is not, who hid the book from everyone? It is, why did different communities draw different boundaries around a work that once circulated widely enough to leave multiple ancient witnesses and survive completely in another language tradition? That question brings us back to the Watchers. Jubilees matters not because it is a universally banned key, but because it preserves a distinctive moral sequence that changes how the story can be understood. We can now answer the central question. Jubilees says the Watchers were sent for a righteous purpose because its version places them inside an ordered history of teaching, law, judgment, and heavenly commission. Their descent is not identified as the first rebellion. The moral turning point comes when they violate the mission and the boundary attached to it. And this is why the book remains more unsettling than a simple story about fallen beings. It does not let the audience watch from a safe distance. The Watchers become a warning about every office, craft, institution, and calling that can be corrupted by the people entrusted to carry it. Their catastrophe is supernatural in scale, but the moral mechanism is painfully familiar. That change reshapes the entire Watcher story. Sin is not movement between heaven and earth by itself. It is the corruption of vocation. The Watcher's transgression contributes to giant violence and wider disorder. Their offspring face judgment. The sinful Watchers are bound. Humanity is judged for its own corruption. After the flood, harmful spirits remain active under limitation, explaining continuing affliction without a hidden genetic survival story. The strongest responsible conclusion is therefore neither that the Watchers caused all evil nor that the supernatural dimension can be ignored. Jubilees assigns supernatural transgression a real causal role, while preserving wrongdoing and accountability among human agents. It distributes responsibility rather than collapsing it. The source transitions remain essential. Genesis reports the compressed baseline and foregrounds human wickedness and violence. First, Enoch expands the drama with oath, illicit arts, giant spirits, and differentiated judgment. Jubilees recasts the sequence by placing an authorized mission before violation and integrating the tradition into its own legal and chronological history. The manuscripts at Qumran show ancient circulation, not universal canon. The Guizi tradition preserves the complete work. Reception varies by community and period, and the evidence does not support a universal coordinated suppression. What Jubilees changes, then, is not a hidden line in Genesis. It changes the moral geometry of the story. The fall becomes more tragic because the Watchers begin with purpose. Their corruption becomes more precise because the text identifies a boundary crossed, and the human audience cannot escape into supernatural blame, because the warning finally returns to human deeds. A mission can be given. A mission can be betrayed. The consequences can outlive the first offenders. But responsibility remains distributed, judgment remains ordered, and the story's deepest warning is not about forbidden origins. It is about the corruption of a good vocation.